Good morning. I'm Jason Hutt, head of Bracewell's Environment and Natural Resources practice. We're delighted to have you join us today for the kickoff of Bracewell's Spring Environmental Law Seminar. It is our fervent hope that this is our last virtual seminar and that you'll make plans to join us in Houston in November to pump fists or shake hands or give a hug. Many of you we haven't seen for a long time and look forward to getting together soon. Over the next 3 days in 90-minute increments, we're slated to cover insights on the Biden administration's initiatives, policies, and political appointees, a deeper dive on climate change, criminal enforcement, and environmental justice. We have a terrific lineup of speakers to share insights, but also hopefully with your help to answer questions. Our seminar does not come together without a tremendous amount of hard work and planning in the background. I want to specifically thank Dawn Pollard for her hard work in helping us to put this together, and our IT team for helping us to hopefully pull it off flawlessly from your technical perspective. They put a lot of hard work into this for help us do it from various locations. I also want to thank our partner, Matt Paulson, whose tireless commitment to seeking your feedback and shaping the agendas has made this event better and better over the years. Before I introduce today's panelists, I want to highlight several other ways that we try to make content available to our clients and friends. In addition to the seminar in May and again in November of each year, we offer hot topic 30-minute webinars on the first Tuesday of each month. Those are at 8:30 Central, 9:30 Eastern. In 2021, in addition to doing that on a monthly basis, there were so many hot topics sort of happening that in March we actually did one every week. So we've had 6 or 8 of these already this year, covering a number of different topics, and those are available. The recordings are available and the slides are available on the Insights tab of our website. So please check those out if you're interested. Excited to announce that our new podcast, the Environmental Law Monitor, will be available in the coming weeks. The Monitor is going to feature conversations on developments in environment and natural resources law and policy from all of the attorneys that you've come to know and hopefully love through our seminars and webinars. Daniel Pope from our Austin office has spearheaded this new way to bring you content, and we're very excited to hear your feedback. With Daniel as our lead interviewer, we'll be discussing new and emerging topics that are on everyone's mind, as well as sharing our insights on perennial topics that shape our work as environmental professionals. So for example, we'll be talking with Jeff Holmstead about the new administration's likely approach to the Clean Air Act. We'll be talking about getting ahead of enforcement through auditing with Tim Wilkins, and thinking about what environmental justice might look like in practice with Kevin Ewing. So the Monitor, I hope, will be a great way to learn about these developments on the go, and we're looking forward to sharing that with you, like I said, in the coming weeks and connecting with you in yet another way. One other way I wanted to just flag for folks is an ESG seminar that's coming up. That's going to be a multidisciplinary seminar, not just primarily our environment and natural resources team, but that is going to be happening in environmental and social and governance reporting. It's going to be on June 15, 16, and 17, like our environmental seminar. It'll be 3 90-minute virtual sessions over those 3 days. Topics include a session on ESG fundamentals, litigation and other legal risks in corporate ESG reporting, including state, SEC, FINRA, and class actions. We'll talk about ESG-related legislative and regulatory developments, and also the international convergence on approaches to ESG assessment and reporting, and the emerging role of ESG in corporate valuation and finance. So I think all of those are super interesting topics. We're reading a ton about them, but the interplay between ESG and these other areas of law, including cybersecurity, labor, supply chain, executive compensation, there's a lot of food for thought there. A lot of our practitioners inside Bracewell are advising and working on those issues, and I think we've assembled a terrific group to talk with you and others about those. And again, it's June 15, 16, and 17, middle of the next month. Turning now to today's panel, we have 3 terrific speakers to share insights about the Biden administration's first 100 days and next 100 days. I'll begin just by introducing Yasmin Nelson, our colleague in the Policy Resolution Group. Yasmin joined Bracewell after serving as a senior economic advisor to then Senator Kamala Harris, where she effectively crafted the senator's economic agenda. Then Senator Harris also tapped Yasmin to serve as her lead advisor on congressional tri-caucus policies. And before that, Yasmin held positions with Senate Finance Committee Chairman Ron Wyden, as well as Senators Cory Booker and Debbie Stabenow. She honed her expertise on the ways of the Senate through her decades of service and put her MBA to use on thorny legislative issues. So super excited to hear from Yasmin today. My longtime partner, Jeff Holmstead, joins Yasmin on the panel. You may already know that Jeff, before coming to Bracewell, had a distinguished career in government, first in the White House counsel's office under President George H.W. Bush, and then as the assistant administrator of EPA for the Office of Air and Radiation at the beginning of the George W. Bush administration. I believe his 5-year tenure as head of EPA's Air Office is still the longest that anyone has served in that position. But a couple of things you probably don't know about Jeff or may know less about, although he's, I think, probably best known as a world-class air lawyer. He has developed a deep understanding of the laws and regulations and agency dynamics surrounding the necessary permits for CCS projects, including Class 6 underground injection control permits. So I think we'll hear some insights about that today. And when he went into EPA in 2001, the current EPA administrator, Michael Regan, served as his special assistant for several months before transferring to EPA's office in North Carolina. So hopefully some insights with respect to the current administrator stemming from that and their relationship that formed then. And last, but certainly not least on our panel is my partner, Ann Navaro. Ann joined us after about 25 years in the government at the Department of Justice, serving in the Environment and Natural Resources Division, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and a stint in the Obama administration's Department of Interior. Ann advises and litigates under the federal laws and policies governing natural resources and the environment. Her particular focus is on the use of public resources and project planning and reviews implicating a whole range of federal environmental laws, but from NEPA to the ESA to the Mineral Leasing Act to the Clean Water Act. I think many of you are probably aware of Ann's successful defense of the Permian Highway Pipeline project over the last 18 months or so. At the end of last week, I thought it was noteworthy that the District Court for the District of Columbia finally denied the DAPL plaintiff's motion for a permanent injunction to stop the flow of oil through that pipeline while the Corps is undertaking its additional environmental review. But the Permian Highway Pipeline decision that resulted from Ann's handiwork in Texas was helpfully cited by the court. So I think we'll hear some good insights from Ann, both about how Department of Interior is taking shape and also energy infrastructure litigation. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Yasmin to start things off. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jason, for that great introduction. I'm thrilled to be a part of this amazing team. I know we have some tech issues right now, but we will get it together, I'm sure. It's exciting to be a part of such a pivotal conversation we're going to be having about the Biden-Harris administration in such a pivotal point in our democracy. As much more than a casual observer of this administration, I can share with you 3 through lines juxtaposed against 4 major pillars of this administration. My experiences with Kamala Harris and on Capitol Hill have guided my thoughts in this analysis. And so the 3 through lines, I know that word is not exactly in the dictionary, but I think the through line is a good way to kind of share the themes that are happening right in the Biden-Harris administration. There's so much happening right now, and it's good to kind of put them into these 3 themes. And so there's 1, this go big or go home, big, bold, transformative policy is really important for President Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, right? They want to ensure that their base of their party feels like they are heard and is taking a what you would say, right, a 180 flip from the previous administration. And then the second through line is to re-engage with the global community. The last administration really made it a point to kind of restrict the U.S.'s engagement with some of the allies. And so, you know, it's really important, I think, for President Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to re-engage with the global community and show that they are the leaders that the United States has historically been. The last through line is personnel as policy. I think this administration is very different than what we've seen in the past. This administration is very much focused on personnel, and that is for a number of reasons. They want to make sure that that the people who make up the country are also seen in their cabinet, and that's not just in their cabinet. It's going to be from Kamala Harris to the cabinet all the way down into some of their staffers. And so, as you can see in the photo on the PowerPoint here, is that there are, you know, just a vast majority of differences in racial in race and sexual orientation and sexual preference. That is very historic. There are going to be many major firsts, and it's going to be seen through a lot of what the administration will be doing. And so these three through lines are major themes in which you can expect from the Biden-Harris administration. And these through lines run through each Biden-Harris pillar. And the four pillars are climate change, COVID relief, and the economy and equality. These four pillars of the Biden-Harris administration are really what they're going to be focusing on, I think, in this term. You know, they want to ensure that climate change and that they are the global leaders on climate change and seen that way. And so they're going to ensure that when they are talking about and doing things, that you're going to see these four major pillars come up in all of the things in which they do, and whether it's in executive orders or you know, regulations. You know, these four pillars are going to be the top priorities for this administration, for sure. And so I'm going to give you some examples of the Go Big or Go Home theme here. And we know that the Biden-Harris administration is looking to instill some transformative policy initiatives. These big, bold agendas are representative of just, you know, the time in our democracy where Joe Biden believes that he needs to put in place these transformative initiatives. And so he put together this Build Back Better plan. And a part of that Build Back Better plan are these three-part initiatives. That's the American Rescue Plan, that's the American Jobs Plan, and the American Families Plan. And these initiatives are robust, right? They cost, you know, at least $1 trillion apiece. And so, you know, it's really evident of what the Joe Biden and Kamala Harris administration wants to do. You know, in the past, we've seen that administrations have been a little more conscious about spending, but we've seen in the last administration that the American people really want the government to do more and to be more participative. So the Joe Biden and Kamala Harris administration is taking a play out of that book and doing the same thing here, right? On March 10th of 2020 of this year, 2021, the House of Representatives passed the American Rescue Plan, and what's known to most people as the third COVID package. And that was another $1.9 trillion in relief to respond to, you know, one of those pillars, right? The COVID-19 relief. And so this is obviously following nearly $4 trillion in COVID relief from the previous administration. And this includes provisions on state aid, state and local governments, hard-hit industries and communities, tax changes affecting individuals and businesses, and some major other provisions, right? This proposal, this actual law, excuse me, is already enacted, right? And so there are a number of industries, state and local governments who are looking to actually implement a lot of the funding that was made available through this, still to this day. So if you have questions about the American Rescue Plan and how it impacts your industry or your participation with the state and local entities, let us know. We're happy to answer some questions on that. Still following on the Go Big or Go Home theme, we have the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan, who are a part of that, Build Back Better initiative that we mentioned earlier. On March 31st of this year, President Joe Biden announced the American Jobs Plan, and that requests an additional $2 trillion over 8 years to modernize the nation's infrastructure. And that infrastructure includes, hard infrastructure like roads, bridges, and ports, but also addresses some things that that historically have not been seen as infrastructure, right? And that's climate crisis, broadband, and housing. And that is going to go back to one of the major themes or through lines that I mentioned earlier, right? The climate crisis and incorporating all of that into this all of government approach that they're doing. To pay for the plan, President Joe Biden suggests a corporate tax hike over the next 15 years to modernize the tax code. And we can talk more about that later. The American Families Plan is the third part and the last part of the Build Back Better initiative, at least to our knowledge. And it's the $1.8 trillion American Family Plan, which is composed of $1 trillion in spending and $800 billion in tax cuts and credit to moderate and low-income families. The spending is partially offset by income tax increases for wealthy Americans, and you've likely heard this. It's wealthy Americans over $400,000 a year. There's also an increased IRS budget for compliance to ensure that any tax cheats are also going to be paying their fair share, quote unquote, and notably does not include any of the estate and gift tax changes proposed during the campaign. And this is obviously different than elimination and step-up basis, but there's more to come, and I think that obviously there is much of these proposals will be left for Congress to actually write the legislation on. And so while we have these kind of guides, these big, bold proposals from the White House, it's really going to be left in Congress's hands, right? The committees of jurisdiction, Ways and Means, and Senate Finance, and others to actually put legislation on the floor and mark up. And so, we have a lot to be expected in the next couple months, but things are starting to roll out. We're starting to hear a lot of things about a major infrastructure plan coming out of Senate Finance Committee Chairman Ron Wyden and others. And so the second piece of the major through lines is the re-engaging with the global communities. And that includes some examples that we all know is one that I think a lot of people point to. On January 20th, the first day in President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris's day was to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. And that was a signal. That was a sign to the global community that this is something that's very important to this administration. And so they made sure that was done on the first day. There are also other examples of re-engaging with the global community, as in the Climate Leaders Summit, where 40 global leaders gathered to show that, quote unquote, from President Joe Biden himself, America is back. And he announced at that meeting, he announced the target of reducing American emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030. And that's a big announcement for a number of industries and a number of communities. And so, you know, we're looking to see how he exactly envisions that to come to fruition. I think another major piece of this is he enlisted Special Envoy on Climate Change as Secretary of State John Kerry, and that's a big deal for a number of reasons that we can kind of get into later. And the last piece of the three-part through lines is actually personnel as policy. And you know, Joe Biden's cabinet includes multiple historic nominations, right? Pete Buttigieg as the Secretary of Transportation. He's the first openly gay secretary confirmed to a cabinet in our history. Janet Yellen is the first woman to lead the Treasury Department. And Deb Haaland is the first Native American in a president's cabinet. And so these kind of historic firsts will mold exactly what we see from this administration. I think it's not only is it historic, but it's going to be definitely something that's going to impact the way they conduct policy and politics. What we can expect from the next 100 days, I expect some of the similar kind of through lines, right? Going big or go home, to continue to re-engage with the global community, and for us to see that the policy, right, that is being enacted is because of the people that are in place. And it's important. I want to just say that last piece, personnel as policy, is important because in order for you to get your point across, in order for you to get your concerns across to this administration, it is important for you to know who is writing the policy and who is there. And I think, you know, it's important to know that here at Bracewell, we have formed a really good relationship with this administration early on. And knowing who personnel is and knowing their personalities is important to ensuring that your voice is heard in this administration. And so you can going back into our three through lines, you can expect that the Biden-Harris administration will continue to build on their Build Back Better initiatives by working with Congress, right, and to continue to negotiate on the infrastructure bill on Capitol Hill, and to know that climate change, equality, COVID relief, and the economy is going to be the center of the admin's focus on these policy changes. And so, you know, recognizing very early that this is the main focus of this administration is important, because when you go in to speak with them, when you, you know, analyze some of the things that they're doing, it's important to keep in mind who and what are the purposes in the grander scheme of things of what's going on.
Thanks very much, Yasmin. So everyone, thanks again for joining us. Jeff and I are going to continue the conversation with Yasmin for a little while, and then he and I are also going to turn to talking about some specific issues at specific agencies that may be important to all of you as you continue to do business in the new environment. So Yasmin, you know, obviously as these policy priorities get implemented by the agencies, of course there's going to be litigation over them, because there always is. But we're also, you know, there are going to be a lot of people who want to move forward and want to figure out the best ways to do business in the new environment, and who want to work cooperatively with the administration to ensure that the administration takes private sector concerns into account as they move forward. So I'm just wondering, how do you expect the administration to work with the private sector, with industry, in order to balance their policy priorities with the needs of the economy and the private sector?
Well, this is a really good question, and I think, it goes back to recognizing those three major through lines juxtaposed against those four major pillars, and recognizing that the admin knows that industry is a major part of U.S. domestic economic growth, right? And so they're going to be open to having discussions, particularly when you have folks who can relay and strategize with you about how to best do that with the administration, right? At Bracewell, we've been working with the White House, we've been working with agencies and with Congress on these policies that directly impact some of our clients. And so it's good to know that we have that relationship, that two-way street, and that the administration is actually listening. I've seen so far, things pop up that our clients are particularly interested in, and we've had conversations, and it's shaped the way things have produced. And so the administration is listening. I believe, it's thinking about this in a bigger, grander scheme of things, recognizing that, there are these bigger initiatives, right? This Build Back Better plan that exists, and that, something that is affecting you or your industry particularly is a part of that, but it is a piece of this grander theme. And so we have to, think about how to best put our strategy into play here. And so my advice to clients and everyone listening is to share your concerns, right? Form like-minded coalitions with other industries or organizations to best formulate and build on the concerns of your industry, right? And to continue to think of the administration in those three through lines, and continue to work that piece, right? It's important to know that the administration is going to listen. I think it may alter what they do just by hearing from you. And so I don't think you should avoid the administration or try to fight it. I think you should try to help them to hear your side of what industry needs.
Hey, Yasmin, this is Jeff. All of us who've been in Washington for a while know that oftentimes the role that the vice president plays is not entirely transparent to outsiders.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious. I guess your longest relationship is with the current vice president. What role do you think she's going to play? Is she going to be involved in any of these environmental issues, environmental justice, or I guess just having a little window into what the role she's playing in the administration would be interesting? Yeah.
So Vice President Kamala Harris is a pivotal part of this administration. I strongly believe that she's a strong voice in the room, and I've had conversations with her and the team and it all suggests that she has various different roles and responsibilities to play in this administration. But I think if you're thinking about this in an aspect of how do you have conversations with the Vice President of the United States, I think you can think about her role substantively being played in foreign policy and immigration, right? Racial equity and police reform are probably some of the top substantive pieces that she'll be advocating on or regulating on, right? And so those are some of the major pieces for her. But if you think about what's happening in Congress right now, right? Congress has a very slim majority, right? Senator Leader Schumer has a 50 majority, and Kamala Harris has a 51 vote. And so one of her major responsibilities will be likely, considered that tiebreaker in the Senate. And so, it's important for Leader Schumer and the administration to be step in step on what's happening in Congress and what's happening in the administration, because she holds that last vote. And that's very important, particularly in these slim margins, right? And if you're thinking about her, and this is the last point I'll make on Kamala Harris, at least for this question, if you're thinking about Kamala Harris as it pertains to climate change, she's a California girl, right? Through and through. She was born in California, and so environmental issues, environmental justice is a very important topic for her, and it's something that she advocated for while she was in the Senate and even before that. And so I think, environmental justice is going to be very important to this administration, and it's going to be very important to her. And, some of her staff have been studying environmental policies all of their life. And, former colleague Ike Irby is with her, and he is a brilliant on this topic of climate change and environmental justice. And so I implore you to think about her and those kind of substantive and process responsibilities.
So that's great, Yasmin. Kind of pulling on one of those threads, where do you think we're heading on environmental justice?
Well, environmental justice is I've already mentioned this, but it's very important to this administration, and I'm sure most of the folks on this WebEx know this, but environmental justice is the equitable treatment of all races and regions when it comes to environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And so this administration, unlike I think many others, has put a particular emphasis on this, right, with Michael, Jeff's friend, Michael Regan, and at the EPA, and as well as, Department of HUD's Marcia Fudge. There's a profound emphasis and a profound all-of-government approach to environmental justice in this administration. And so it's really important to know that those people are the ones who are putting forward this policies and these regulations, right? And to know that they are the folks who are actually putting these into place. And I think that, the last point I'll make on this particular stance is it's important to know that the administration is going to be working very closely with Congress on this, and the people who are going to be advising advising the administration on this are going to be the leaders of the Tri-Caucus associations, right? That's the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the Congressional Asian Pacific Islander caucuses. Those caucuses have a clear plan and a clear agenda for environmental justice is posted on their websites. Individual congressmen and congresswomen have it on their websites, and so it's important to know that the CDC, the CHC, and the CAPAC have these priorities. And to know that these are the people who are going to be advising President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris on these issues. And so I think you should look to Congress on what to expect from environmental justice, for sure.
Well, that actually brings me to a question I wanted to ask. Given the the narrow margins in Congress. And the fact that it seems like a lot of the Biden priorities really do depend on Congress. It looks like the infrastructure plan is sort of at the centerpiece of their climate change plans.
Yeah.
How do you see? I mean, is it realistic that we're going to see all those things? And what are we going to see, like on energy taxes? Is that another possibility for a revenue raiser? There's certainly people who argue that you could do a carbon tax on a reconciliation bill. I'm just curious, how likely it is that we'll see some real significant action from Congress on some of these issues.
Well, Jeff, that's a lot to unpack. But I think the best way to try to think about this, particularly, is that these bold, progressive, transformative policies that are coming out of the White House are very big, very robust, and Congress has not been able to, at least in recent history, been able to actually put out legislation that would meet that kind of threshold. I think, obviously the COVID packages have been unprecedented, and that's a response directly to the pandemic, which is very separate than what we're talking about here, which is infrastructure and climate change, right? And these bills on equality and equity, right? And so these proposals are going to need, either to go through reconciliation, right, which all you need is a simple majority to do so, or they won't happen. And that's kind of the long and short of it, right? Joe Biden has historically been someone who wants to work bipartisanly, and I think he's given a timeline for how far that will actually, for when he can actually get that through, right? And I think that timeline is coming up very short. We've seen, just this past weekend, the administration say, likely after the Memorial holiday, they'll have to, kick things into high gear and start to think about a budget package, which would then come to fruition, this reconciliation, right? And so it's important to, I think about how or if, anything bipartisan can happen. And we've seen, recently that the administration and Republicans are at odds. Even this past weekend, the administration went down in the amount of money that they wanted to offer for infrastructure by, I believe, $600 billion, and it's still, Republicans immediately declined to that offer. And so it's important to recognize that they are polar opposites right now, as it were, in terms of infrastructure, right? Which means that, if this can happen bipartisanly, ultimately it will happen by reconciliation. And ultimately that means, the people in Senate Finance and Senate or in House Ways and Means will have the pen on this and will likely be the people who are writing the legislation that goes into law. The second piece I think you mentioned in here is energy taxes. And before I get to that, I want to just mention that corporate tax is a big piece of how they intend to pay for some of these packages. And so it was set at 21% from the previous administration, and Biden intends to move it to 28%, which is, still lower than the 35% under President Obama's administration. But when you're talking about linking that to infrastructure, the polling shows that the American people support an increase in the corporate tax as it pertains to paying for infrastructure, right? And we know that the administration is following that polling, and so I think you should look to that to be a big push. And then the last piece is that you mentioned energy taxes. And there's, a lot of good work that can be done in that space to support a clean energy transition, right? The hydrogen production tax credit is included in the Biden infrastructure package for wind and solar. And there are, the plan does address, eliminating fossil fuels, and one that people point to the most is the credit for drilling costs. But there were no specifics as to which fossil fuels would actually face the chopping block in this. And so the specifics in the plan really leave Congress with the pen, right? That leaves Senate Finance and House Ways and Means and some of the other committees on jurisdiction for that. And it's obvious that in the past couple of weeks there have been a number of bills introduced from members on those committees, and they are going to place the marker for Congress to put the pen to paper and get it into law. And so the real challenge is just getting the energy tax through Congress, right? That is going to be the Biden-Harris administration's biggest push is getting an energy tax bill through Congress.
Okay. Well, great. Thank you. I think at the end, we're going to have a bit more time for Q&A. But I wanted to go and focus it a bit more specifically on kind of what's going on in the executive branch when it comes to environmental issues. And I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about what we're seeing primarily from EPA, what we're seeing in terms of regulatory and policy initiatives. And then Ann is going to talk more about sort of developing specific projects and some of the issues that are faced in the natural resources world. Okay, so the first 100 days, the big picture, you probably know all this by heart, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. I just want to highlight a couple of things. President Biden has done a record number of executive orders, but he only barely beat the number of executive orders that were signed by President Trump. This is an approach that has been increasingly used by presidents of both parties as a way to both signal publicly what their agenda is, and in some ways just to get a little credit for directing his employees in the executive branch about what they should do. So when it comes to EOs, not a big difference really between, well, except in content. But I do want to point out that when it comes to these other things, there really is a huge difference. The Biden administration came in with large teams of people who had been focusing on environment and energy issues for a long time, for at least 4 years. We've seen throughout the administration that they have folks who have worked on this issue in advocacy groups, in academia, a few in the private sector, but they are well organized. They have people with experience, and they've moved very quickly on a whole range of things in a way that we just didn't see under the Trump administration. That took a long time to get organized. You've heard about their whole of government approach towards climate change and environmental justice. I guess none of us really work with all the different parts of the federal government, but no matter where you go, no matter which agency you look at, there are people in those agencies who are tasked with working on climate change and on environmental justice. The primary focus so far of the Biden administration has been on reversing actions taken by the Trump administration. And I'm going to talk about just a few of those in a second, but just so you know, and again, it's no surprise, much of what we've seen in the first 100 days and much of what we'll see in the coming months is designed at reversing things that the Trump administration did. I did want to highlight, I think, two big picture things that are important. And Yasmin already alluded to one, that the president announced a new target, a new nationally determined contribution under the Paris Climate Accords that would set at least a goal of reducing CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030. That's going to be a tall order. I'm not sure it's possible. I know it's not possible without congressional action, but that I think was intended to be both a signal and a touchstone that people will look to. And then we're not going to talk a lot about the social cost of carbon. In fact, we probably won't talk, well, we'll talk a bit about it here. I think there's another session tomorrow on climate change where there'll be more focus on that. But just be aware that the new social cost of carbon will have an impact on a number of things, certainly on various regulatory initiatives. And we'll talk a bit more about the impact that it may have on project development. But these are sort of the big picture things that we've seen in the first 100 days. Okay, I didn't go to Harvard Law School, but I'm going to put a plug in. They have a website that's sponsored by the Harvard Environmental and Energy Program that is kind of remarkable in its level of detail and its content. And so I've listed the link there. I'm only just going to call it because we don't have time to go into all of the details of the things that they've done in the first 100 days. But if you look on that website, there's probably more than you would ever have time to read. But one of the things it does is it tracks each of the actions that President Biden called for in his executive orders. And they count 140 specific agency actions for review that are required under the executive orders. My friends at EPA tell me that doing those things have occupied all of their time and more during the first 100 days. And it's kind of a remarkable number of actions that the president has already directed agencies to do. In addition to those 104 things that are specifically called for in the regulation, in the executive orders, there's about 30 other regulatory actions that have been taken to reverse or revise Trump administration policies. And those are also listed separately on the website. So that's worth looking for those of us who are keeping track of what's going on in these areas. And I also wanted to just call your attention. I know we probably don't have a lot of corporate disclosure experts on this call, but that has really been a focus. And if you look at the things that have been done by the Treasury, by the Fed, announced by the SEC, announced by the Office of the Comptroller of Currency, this sort of obscure agency and Department of Labor, there's been a number of things related to disclosure by institutions dealing with the financial risks of climate change, the physical risks of climate change, and they've actually been quite busy on a number of different things. So I hope I haven't taken too long to summarize what we've already seen during the first 100 days. It may be more interesting to talk about what we'll see over the next 100 days, and you know that in the regulatory world, 100 days isn't very long. It'll take longer than that to do a lot of these things. But here are the big things that we know are coming up when it comes to climate change. We will soon see, probably by the end of July, a new proposal to deal with greenhouse gas emission standards and CAFE standards for light cars and trucks. I know that many of you are aware of the discussions that are going on with Quad OA and an effort to regulate methane emissions from both new and existing oil and gas sources. Again, those of you who are involved probably in some of those discussions know that the proposal will not only sort of reverse some of the things that were done with the Trump administration, but it will begin the process of regulating existing sources of methane as well as new. And those regulations will also extend to the transportation and storage parts of oil and gas operations. So we expect to see a proposal. The goal is by September. I'm not sure they'll make that, but that's sort of the second highest thing on their list of priorities after the CAFE standards. Actually, go back just for 1 second. All right. I did want to mention that they've talked about the third major initiative they have for climate change is to regulate CO2 emissions from the power sector. They really don't know how they are going to proceed yet. If you believe the DC Circuit has the final word on what EPA's legal authority is, you might say that they have broad authority to do something like the Clean Power Plan, maybe even a cap and trade program. But I think the administration is aware that the DC Circuit is probably not the final word, and anything they do that's too creative with the power sector would likely go to the Supreme Court. So I think they're still exploring options and are a long way away from having any kind of a proposal for that. I think we may see a revised NSPS for CO2 emission from gas-fired turbine. They would like to find ways to regulate CO2 emissions from other industrial sectors, but they really have limited tools under the Clean Air Act to do that. One of the things that has not received a lot of attention that actually is a realistic possibility is that they would begin to regulate methane as an ozone precursor. As you know, states and companies are required to control their VOC emissions in order to deal with ozone. Methane is actually a volatile organic compound, but since the 70s, it's been excluded from regulation because it's not very photochemically reactive. But there's a petition recently submitted. EPA is evaluating whether it should begin to regulate methane as an ozone precursor, and that has lots of implications. We won't see a NAAQS for CO2, notwithstanding what you read in the press. They have no interest in doing that. There's been talk about a much more stringent ozone NAAQS as a way to kind of backdoor regulate CO2. I don't think they're going to do that either. I did just want to call attention to the CCS permitting. We don't have time to go into that today, but that's been a very interesting project with a number of people exploring that, but only a couple of companies thus far who've actually submitted applications. Okay, and then my last slide. These are the other big things that I think we'll see in the coming weeks and months. There will be an update of the cross-state air pollution rule that will affect really primarily the power sector, although it may also include industrial boilers. There will be even though they don't have to review the NAAQS for another 5 years, I know they will review the PM 2.5 standard, and I'm quite confident that they will actually lower that standard. With ozone, it's a different issue, and I think there's a good chance that they will just leave that in place. They're going to spend a lot of time trying to come up with a middle ground on waters of the United States. There's going to be a lot of effort to actually begin implementation of the 2015 ozone NAAQS. I suspect that we will see new regulations under the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and RCRA dealing with conventional pollutants on coal-fired power plants. Although they don't have clear path to regulate CO2 emissions, I think they are aware that if they can increase the cost of operating those plants, it will make them uneconomic and would fulfill their goal, I think, of trying to close down coal-fired power plants by 2030. Whether they actually do that, it remains to be seen, but I think you'll see regulations there too. And then just quickly, I want to mention the last bullet, and that is, there was a lot of attention paid to the NSR reforms that were done under the last administration, and also the elimination of the so-called once in, always in policy. They've really not made any moves in that direction, and it's not clear that they are going to do any kind of a wholesale rejection of those. The EPA staff folks have spent a lot of time both analyzing and trying to come up with sort of sensible policies. And ultimately, I know there are several things that the new political appointees were inclined to do, not only on NSR, but on other issues. And then after being fully educated by the EPA staff, they've decided to leave well enough alone. And I think we could well see that when it comes to the NSR reforms and the once in, always in policy. All right, so that's a quick rundown on the regulatory side of things, and I'll turn it over now to Ann.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Please, everybody, if you have any questions that you'd like us to address, please put them in the chat. We should have a good amount of time after I'm done speaking to address some of those questions, and we'd love to have some kind of back and forth. So any questions or observations are very welcome. So I want to pick up on some of the themes discussed by Yasmin and Jeff in the context of both project development and the use of public resources like federal lands and federal resources. I like to describe my practice area as kind of the non-EPA area of environmental and natural resources law. And so that's where I'm going to focus. First, just some quick discussion of the context, which I'm sure is all familiar to you. And I'm not expecting you to read the long list of statutes on the left side of your screen. But just to give you, a reminder of how many moving parts there can be when you are trying to build a major infrastructure project or use public resources when it comes to gaining federal permissions or reviews for any elements of the project. So those are kind of the key legal ingredients. And then on the right are some of the key federal agency players, all of which are obviously have been since day one of this administration and continue to be responsive to the administration's priorities and implementing them in a very much on the ground fashion. And so we've seen already, and we're going to continue to see, a range of ways that these agencies implement the administration's priorities, from secretarial orders to internal guidance to kind of down in the weeds internal process directives to very public rulemakings and positioning in litigation. All of those tools are used to implement every administration's agenda, and every agency does it a bit differently. So, there's not one thing to look out for. You need to kind of track these things on a per agency basis. And I just wanted to mention a couple of examples. For example, the Department of the Interior in April issued a secretarial order 3399 that got a lot of attention because it was a multi-page kind of directive to the department on how a lot of priorities were going to be implemented, from addressing the climate crisis to restoring integrity and decision making. The order provided some very specific direction, but it also directed the agency to spend some time developing implementation tools. And so that's what we're going to continue to see. In another example that's kind of down in the weeds and sometimes hard to find, if you're not paying close attention, was the Bureau of Land Management's oil and gas leasing instruction memoranda. So these instruction memoranda are the way the BLM implements changes in policy direction. They don't come out for public review. They're not a rulemaking. But this instruction memorandum changed some aspects of the oil and gas leasing process in ways that will be meaningful to entities looking to secure new oil and gas leases, to the extent that continues to happen in this administration. So those are two examples from the Department of the Interior. I also just wanted to follow on with Yasmin's observation about kind of the personnel is policy mantra. Certainly at many of these agencies, we're seeing appointments from various tribes, from non-governmental organizations, from academia. And it's interesting because a lot of these folks have done a lot of writing on the issues of interest that certainly perhaps give a preview into what their interest may be in advancing the administration's agenda. One example, at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Corps obviously itself does not have any political appointees, but the level above the Corps, at the Assistant Secretary of the Army level, the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works nominee is Mike Connor, who was a Deputy Secretary of the Interior in the Obama administration, also came out of the Bureau of Reclamation, and he's also an enrolled member of the Taos Pueblo. And his principal deputy from the Pacific Northwest is a member of the Nez Perce tribe and also focuses on fisheries management. So just those two individuals, I think, are an interesting balance. Mike, whose background is very much dam management, and continuing dam operations in an environmentally sensitive manner. And then Jamie, whose background may include, wondering whether those dams are worth it in terms of impacts to fisheries. So just briefly on the first 100 days, because I know you all have paid close attention to what's been going on in the first 100 days. Of course, we've had the orders that set major policies. We've had direction from the White House to implement those policies. We've seen a wave of rescissions of Trump orders and directives. Some are very visible, some are lower key. For example, the Assistant Secretary of the Army rescinded a Trump administration directive that prohibited the Corps of Engineers from consulting with tribes when assessing jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act. So that was kind of a low-key rescission maybe, but along with it came a directive to the Corps to reconsider its tribal consultation policy. Of course, in the first 100 days, there was also some low-hanging fruit, the Keystone permit, issuing the Vineyard Wind permit for the first major offshore wind project, the pause in oil and gas leasing on public lands, and the administration starting off with some straightforward rulemakings. So those are certainly indicators of where the administration will continue to head as it implements the details of its agenda. But, it's interesting that everything is not black and white. And as Yasmin pointed out, the administration is very sensitive to the economy and private sector needs. And this administration, also tends to, or I think is more likely to be fairly respectful of kind of institutionalist positioning in various subject matters. So, for example, after an initial pause on Department of the Interior authorizations related to oil and gas development on existing leases, they have now resumed at what I perceive to be a fairly normal pace along fairly normal tracks. I'm sure you all noticed that the Corps of Engineers did not order the Dakota Access Pipeline to stop transporting oil, despite the fact that the Dakota Access Pipeline now no longer has a federal permission to cross federal property. Of course, the Department of the Interior has issued an order prioritizing renewable development on public lands and waters. I mentioned the Secretary of the Army's consultation policy. And then the new administration is also continuing defense of some fairly controversial decisions that a lot of the new administration's kind of natural constituencies objected to. The administration has defended eminent domain authority in the pipeline context at the Supreme Court. The new administration has taken some fairly traditional positions in litigation on such things as what kind of standing environmental groups have to show to bring lawsuits. So in terms of the specifics of what I see happening in the next 100 days as it pertains to project development and use of public resources like federal oil and gas, federal waters for wind development, there's certainly a lot of things on the menu. And I don't think all of them are going to be accomplished in the next 100 days. But I think, this slide kind of sets out what I perceive to be some of the critical things that the administration is going to be focusing on. And certainly at the top of that list is revisiting the rule implementing the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And I think, as most folks on the call know, NEPA is really critical if you are pursuing any sort of federal permission, any lease, right-of-way, approval to produce oil and gas, Corps of Engineers permit, Endangered Species Act permit, anything that might be necessary for project development. The government first has to go through the environmental review required under the National Environmental Policy Act. So it's extremely critical. as you all probably also know, the Trump administration completed the first rulemaking implementing the National Environmental Policy Act since the rules were initially promulgated. And its critics called the Trump NEPA rule the biggest and most audacious deregulatory action of the Trump administration. And so it's very clear that it's a priority for the Council on Environmental Quality to re-engage and revisit the NEPA rule. In the meantime, it's not all kind of smooth sailing. Agencies have been essentially directed to continue doing business under the old NEPA rules because of the interpretation that the Trump administration NEPA rule has sufficient discretion to allow agencies to continue what is perceived to be a more expansive review. I think there's going to be confusion about that in the field, and it may cause some delays and raise questions. The Department of the Interior, of course, has said, well, if there's a clear conflict between the two rules, that needs to be elevated. But that is also a potential recipe for confusion. So that's really a major thing that I expect to see. I expect is the most important thing that CEQ is working on right now. And one interesting thing that raises in my mind is the tension between going back to what's perceived as a more thorough and expansive environmental review, but also wanting to expedite renewable energy projects. So I imagine in a new NEPA rule, we will see some effort to perhaps preserve or recreate some efficiencies while at the same time addressing some of the things that were perceived to be particularly objectionable. In terms of the Department of the Interior, of course, one of the critical things at issue there is what the Department of the Interior is going to do going forward with oil and gas leasing on public lands. Their report on next steps is due in mid-June. So everyone is kind of waiting for that. Some other key issues that I expect to see them address in the next 100 days are consideration of a permitting program under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Probably most folks know that the Biden administration has reversed a Trump administration interpretation of that act and gone back to the older view that the MBTA makes incidental take of birds criminally prohibited. But the Department of the Interior has never had a permit program like it has under the Endangered Species Act to allow kind of a common sense approach to complying with that act. There was an attempt at the end of the Obama administration to do that, but it didn't get very far. So I expect that to be coming as well. And then for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, most of its nationwide permits, which are critical to a lot of infrastructure development, expire in March of 2022. So under their normal schedule, they will be issuing draft nationwide permits probably early in the fall. And those, I think, are going to create a lot of interest because of the controversy over Nationwide 12 and environmental justice and climate issues in the context of those permits. So the bottom line from my perspective is that, as always, with the change of administration, even though it seems to be getting a little more dramatic over the years, there's a lot to navigate. And some of the developments may be favorable, some may be unfavorable from your perspective, some may be neutral. But I think there's also a lot of evidence that the new team understands there are limits and respects kind of established ways of doing business. Of course, as with any administration, they will test those limits and they may find them as they go along or ultimately through litigation. So I think the key is to continue to watch and anticipate and to be as nimble as possible in order to adjust going forward. So we would love to take any questions that you may have in our last 15 minutes.
Hey, Ann, while we're waiting for other questions, you've raised an issue that has been much commented upon, at least in conservative circles in DC, and that is, the administration's ambitious agenda for green energy runs square into the problems that people have long had with NEPA, especially, but some of the other acts. Do you think that tension may ultimately result in sort of some more common sense reforms to NEPA, or do you think it's kind of a stalemate? And then secondly, if they do, is it possible that they could do reforms that only expedite permitting of clean energy and leave them the way they are when it comes to fossil fuel kinds of projects? I mean, is that something that would be legally permissible under NEPA, which is basically, move certain types of things to the front of the line?
Yeah, I don't, answering that last question first, Jeff, it's hard for me to see how you could implement kind of multiple sets of NEPA rules that apply to different kinds of projects. I don't think the statute anticipates that. And, NEPA applies to pretty much everything the government does, from, grant issuance to rights of way to, tiny small permits. And so I think it would be very difficult to justify a different approach given the very broad purpose of the statutes and broad wording. I mean, where I can see different types of projects being treated differently is not necessarily in the regulations, but in what has to be looked at for the specific project. So a lot of critics of the Trump administration NEPA rule perceive that rule as precluding or not requiring robust analysis of climate impacts. Certainly, any Biden administration NEPA rule, even if it doesn't address climate specifically, which the new rule, the Trump rule, does not by name, I expect that a Biden rule will make clear that a climate type of impact is amongst the types of impacts that need to be considered by agencies in appropriate circumstances. So, think about how that might apply to different types of projects, and so how it might change the analysis. I mean, if the government is looking at oil and gas leasing, it's obviously going to need to do a deep dive into greenhouse gas emissions from downstream use of minerals produced from federal lands. And it's going to be trying to figure out how to put a new lens on how to balance those impacts against the cost of greenhouse gas emissions. So that sort of analysis would be very different from what we might see in assessing an offshore wind project, which would not have those same kind of life cycle analysis questions for greenhouse gas emissions. So I don't expect the rule to treat different types of projects differently, but I do expect that, that ultimately the way the rule is applied will result in lengthier and more complex analysis for some projects and perhaps more efficient types of analysis for other projects. I'm just not sure how, the government's actions could survive judicial review if they somehow decided that, oil and gas leases by rule have to take 3 years, but review for wind projects by rule only have to take a year. I think that would be a very difficult path. So in terms of questions, I don't think we're seeing any particular questions. Jeff, a question for you. I mean, I kind of live in this world, that is very much governed to some extent and pushed forward by NEPA. And often agencies take the view that the very specific regulation that EPA might do, whether it's in the climate space or other air issues, is really outside their purview, and that they're going to defer to state permitting or EPA permitting on those issues to a large extent. But how do you see the work that EPA is doing and is going to be doing relative to greenhouse gas emissions as perhaps factoring into the work of other agencies?
I can see it. I can see it mostly when you're talking about any kind of a project that involves fossil fuel, because any kind of a significant project will need a Clean Air Act permit. And for any major source permit, they will have to do an evaluation of greenhouse gases. And in particular, they will have to, the permitting authority, whether it's EPA or the state, will have to determine what the best available control technology is for that source. And so there will be a specific finding by either EPA or a state regulatory agency that, whatever the permit says is the best available control technology. And I just wonder if that will sort of ease the way with, especially under NEPA and the kind of evaluations that need to be done. Clean Air Act rules are exempt from NEPA, but I think projects, just because they require a Clean Air Act permit, doesn't get them out of NEPA. But I think the fact that there's some regulatory oversight in the permitting will probably, in some ways, make at least ease the process a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation, because one of the things I'm thinking about is how some of these agencies, like the Department of the Interior or even NOAA Fisheries, Corps of Engineers, are going to use climate in their decision making, for example, or even environmental justice concerns in ways that they haven't before. Even though they've assessed the issues, they haven't necessarily been decision drivers. And so I'm thinking about how that may or may not change in this administration. But certainly in the context where EPA has delved deeply into an issue and assessed something like greenhouse gases, other agencies, may be able to say, well, we're going to look at it, but EPA has, or the state agency has made its decision, and so we're not going to kind of use that as an element on which to base a decision.
Well, I have a couple of other questions for you, but I think they may involve issues that will come up with our environmental justice panel that's coming up, and maybe on the climate change side, because I hope that we'll have a chance to get your thoughts on the social cost of carbon and how that may impact project development and also EJ. Because as I thought through the EJ issues, I don't know that it will have a big impact on regulatory actions, but it certainly is likely to have an impact on sort of project development, whether it's under the Clean Air Act or something else. So I will look forward to getting maybe your thoughts or the thoughts from others on those things in the next couple of days.
Well, and I think on that note, Yasmin, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think, you guys really wrapped up a lot in the last bit. So I'm really excited to see the next seminar from you guys.
All right, well, that's great. And in fact, I think Jeff and I will be back with our partner, Kevin Ewing, tomorrow morning to kind of do a deep dive into climate. So we hope to see you all then.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.